on the VM Options tab. General option, we have the VM name. We can rename that there, or of course we can right click it in the navigation pane back in the main window. We have the location of the virtual machine's config file. So that is considered the location of the virtual machine. When you see settings that say store with virtual machine, like how we store the swap file with the virtual machine, it means it will store it in the same location as specified in these two variables. Guest OS. What guest OS are we running inside the virtual machine? Great for ensuring compatibility. Guest OS lock. So if someone connects to the virtual machine's console and we've logged into Windows, we can set it so that when we disconnect from the vSphere console, it will automatically lock the session. So if someone reopens the vSphere console, they have to still log into the guest OS. That could be handy if you do regularly allow other people to connect to your vSphere. Maybe you have a number of junior techs who do routine administration tasks, and you want to make sure that if you've accidentally left yourself logged into a virtual machine, that they can't hijack your session. Encryption. So it is possible to encrypt virtual machines in vSphere. It's not part of the Foundations exam, so we'll just move on to the next one. Power management. So in the vSphere console, we can right click on a virtual machine and we can say standby or suspend. And this here tells us what we want to do. We can either send a command to the guest OS to put it into standby mode, like if you imagine a laptop, you close the lid and it goes into standby, that it will do the same as that, or we can suspend the virtual machine. Suspending the virtual machine is a vSphere specific operation where it will pause the running state of the virtual machine. It will take all of its memory from the physical memory and store it in a file. So it's a bit more like the suspend to disk features or the hibernate feature in Windows. And we have there, we can configure Wake on LAN support. That does, however, require that the guest OS is in standby mode. If the OS is powered off completely, if the virtual machine is powered off completely, Wake on LAN will not function. We can specify what we want our default actions to be for power commands. So when we're in the vSphere console and we press the red stop button, do we want it to just power off the VM without shutting down the OS, or do we want to shut down the guest OS first? We can specify all that. Tools upgrades. This can be handy if you have updated your hosts to a newer version and you want to configure your virtual machines to automatically upgrade the VMware Tools to the latest version. What you can do is you can take this, and each time the virtual machine starts up, it will check the status of the VMware Tools. If the VMware Tools are not up to date, it will update them and reboot it again. So that can be handy for if you have virtual machines that you have not been able to reboot to install the VMware Tools in a controlled fashion, and you want to do it opportunistically. The next time someone reboots that VM, we're going to update the VMware Tools while we are at it. Virtualization-based security. This is a new feature of newer versions of Windows and some other operating systems. Not in the scope of the vSphere Foundations exam, so I'm not going to go into it in much depth here. Boot options. I think I already mentioned this. So are we using the newer EFI standard, or are we using the older BIOS system? If your operating system, so Windows 8 or Windows 10, supports EFI, I would urge you to do so. However, if you're using an older operating system that doesn't support EFI or isn't properly compatible with it, then leave it in BIOS. This again gets set when you choose which operating system you are using when you deploy the virtual machine. Windows 7 and Windows Server 2008 R2 did have support for EFI, but it wasn't very stable at the time. So if you are using Windows 7 or 2008 R2 in some of your VMs, I would recommend leaving that on the older BIOS setting. You'll find it is more reliable. Boot delay, we can set the virtual machine in milliseconds to wait for, say, 5,000 milliseconds when it reboots. This means that we have a chance to open the vSphere remote console and do something like F8 to get the Windows 10 or Windows operating system startup menu if we're having issue with the OS. So this is actually quite handy. Force EFI setup. So next time the virtual machine boots, instead of booting the operating system, we want to open the EFI setup, the BIOS, if you will, on the virtual machine. That can be handy if we need to do something like booting from a different device. And if the virtual machine fails to find a boot device, do we want it to keep retrying? By default, it will just sit there with a message saying no boot device. Disable acceleration. I would not recommend turning that on. That will force the virtual machine to use software-based virtualization technology rather than hardware. That will have an impact on performance. It's only useful for testing and diagnostics and in a lab environment. You wouldn't want to run a production virtual machine with that ticked. Swap file location, we already discussed this, of course. However, where are we going to store the swap file for the virtual machine? Configuration parameters, we can specify some more advanced configuration parameters and latency sensitivity. So if the disks for this virtual machine start to become slow, how sensitive is it to that slowness? And finally, Fiber Channel NPIV, Port ID virtualization. This relates to Fiber Channel SANs. By default, in a Fiber Channel SAN, the SAN administrator will just see the hosts. However, in some environments, you might not be happy with that. The SAN administrator might want to be in control of the connection from the virtual machines to the SAN. This NPort ID virtualization allows you to virtualize the Fiber Channel port in the virtual machine and actually send a unique port ID to the SAN. So the SAN administrator has visibility of not just the hosts, but the individual virtual machines. And he can mask SAN LUNs to individual virtual machines instead of having to allocate them to the whole host.